Good evening and welcome to this next episode in our series on this book study about Dave Andrews' little book called Plan B, Be the Change You Want to See in the World. Looks like this. And we are now up to the last chapter in the Beatitude called the Peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And that can be found in Matthew 5:9. Yes, 5:9. And we've already had 2 episodes in this chapter. And in the first ones, we talked about this idea of retaliation. The Old Testament talks a lot about an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that was the law of the day of Jesus' time. And to this day, we're still experiencing this. To just today, about an hour ago, I believe someone was executed in a prison somewhere just for that. He had killed 3 people, and now the state decided that they needed to kill him as well. So those are still remnants that are still existing to this day. And the other concept that we talked about earlier on was the concept of Jesus, the Lamb of God, and that he is also seen in other places as a shepherd. So he's at the same time shepherd and a lamb. He's a sacrificial lamb. God sacrificed him to save the mankind. We are also sometimes in images as lambs among wolves, but the idea is that we should not become wolves ourselves. We should remain lambs, just like Jesus did. And then today, we're now up to the last part of this chapter. And it begins on page 56. I hope you have the book by now. Otherwise, I would recommend that you get it. It's a great little book to daily inspiration. So here on page 56, is starting today. For 3 centuries, Christianity was a completely pacifist movement. The apostles taught Christians the pacifist principle. Love does no harm to its neighbor. Romans 13, verse 10. Because in the 4th century, which is 300 and something, Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome. And that changed everything. Suddenly, the church had power, and power corrupts. So things started to change really, really quickly here. And this is what Paul has to say about that. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. On the contrary, If your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. And that's in Romans 12, verses 14 to 21. Because that was the order of the day in those times as well, that punishment was based on retaliation or revenge. And that's not a coincidence that we're talking about that here, because Romans 13 and Romans 12 are key chapters in our understanding of how the state works for us who call ourselves Christians. So everything changed, and pretty quickly. Two fellows, Ambrose and Augustine. I don't know if it's Augustine or Augustine, but either way. The two fellows came up with a list of times where a war would be justified. And they came up with 8 times, 8 characteristics of a just war, and we're going to talk about those in just a minute. The chapter on page 56 reads, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Ambrose and Augustine developed a set of criteria to call those in power who make war to be accountable to the principles of justice. They argue that in order for a war to be conducted according to the principles of justice, it would need to meet 8 specific conditions. And here they are. 1, it would need to be motivated by a just cause. And the only cause considered to be just was to stop the killing of large numbers of people. So that's, debatable what is just, but in their terms, it is to prevent the killing of large numbers of people. And, you could say that the UN peacekeeping forces around the world have basically done that. They only engage in actual warfare when it was to defend some innocent people. Others will argue that that is not allowed either. That is contrary to what Jesus was teaching. Yeah. Number two. It would need to be administered by just authority. Duly constituted authorities had to proceed carefully according to due process before taking action. So this book was written shortly after the Iraq War started, and those of you who remember well will remember that the high-level government official went to the UN and argued for starting this war. And you could say that that is an authority. The UN is authority by some people's recognition, but not by others. Yeah. Number three, it would also need to be a last resort. After all means of negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and nonviolent sanctions have been exhausted. Yeah. So who gets to decide when all these other alternatives have been exhausted? That's the question. Number 4, it will need to be for a just purpose, to secure the welfare, safety, and security of all parties in the dispute, including the enemy. So, again, who defines what just means here? So it would have to be something that secure the welfare and safety of all the parties, including the enemy. And technically both parties in the conflict are enemies. Each is the enemy of the other, so they're both enemies, really. And number 5, it will need to be a reasonable risk, not a futile gesture, but a realistic venture with a reasonable hope of success. So you can't just willy-nilly go out and start a war. It has to have some kind of reasonable likelihood of success. But again, who gets to decide what that is? Number 6, it will need to be cost-effective. The outcomes of victory would outweigh the human costs of battle. Yeah, what does that mean? It's really difficult to to give precise value to any of this. Number 7, that any government intending to go to war should announce their intentions, articulating the conditions that would need to be met to avert it, in order to avoid going to war, if at all possible. So I watched a documentary about the fellow who debriefed Saddam Hussein after he was captured. And it turned out that the Americans or coalition forces were trying to convince the world that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction and they were prepared to use them. So Saddam Hussein, in his prison conversations with this fellow, revealed that there was no way he could admit that they didn't have weapons of mass destruction, because that would be a sign of weakness. And if they were seen as any kind of weak, the Iranians would attack them immediately. So he couldn't say that, even if it were true. And he couldn't tell the Americans either, because that would leak to the Iranians as well. So that would be a risk for the Americans. So he could not comply with whatever demands the coalition forces had because of this threat from the Iranians, even if he wanted to. So number 8, that if the war were to go ahead, not only the ends but also the means would need to be just. Non-combatants must be protected. Once combatants surrender, they too must be protected from slaughter, and all prisoners must be protected from torture. And most people have heard about the Geneva Convention. I think it kind of governs what happens to war prisoners, what you can do to them and what you can't do to them. And it is really tempting not to do that. It's tempting to treat them bad because they are the enemy. Once they're captured, you're supposed to treat them humanely. But not everyone complies with that. So, and Dave Andrews goes on, according to these criteria, our current wars are not just wars. I don't know what the other wars were, but there was probably some. As Christians committed to peace and justice, we should robustly oppose these hostilities and actively seek reconciliation with our enemies. Yeah, that doesn't require any comments from me. That's obvious. Christ says that only committed peacemakers have a legitimate claim to be called the children of God. So, with that sentence, kind of shifts the key word from peacemaker to children of God. So the main word in that whole sentence is the children of God. And only the ones who are peacemakers can claim to be children of God. So that is the end of this chapter in the book. And we will then start next week with Matthew 5, verse 10, which is the last one. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And we'll do that next week. Thank you all for coming, and I appreciate that very much. And look forward to seeing you next week.